The prairie wind howled like a lonesome coyote as the last streaks of daylight bled into the storm clouds over Rattlesnake Ridge. Eliza Hartman wiped her calloused hands on her leather apron, squinting at the crooked fence post she'd been wrestling with for the better part of an hour. "Hell's bells," she muttered, tossing the bent nail into the dirt, just as three sharp raps cut through the wind. The sound came again, not from the rickety barn where her last hired hand had quit a week prior, but from her front porch. Two mirror-image girls in patched calico dresses stood shoulder to shoulder on the warped pine boards, their breath visible in the November chill. The bolder one, a freckled scrap of a thing, with a missing front tooth, planted her hands on her hips. "Ma'am, our daddy says you're the best horse breaker this side of the Red River. He also says you're prettier than a spotted pony at sunrise." Eliza nearly dropped her hammer. The quieter twin clutched a burlap sack that clinked like preserves jars, her eyes darting to the Colt Peacemaker hanging by the door. "Your daddy got a name, or he just goes around sending 6-year-olds to sweet-talk strangers?" Eliza's voice was drier than the Dust Bowl summer of '88. "He's Wyatt Callahan," the toothless wonder announced, as if that explained everything. The name hit Eliza like a stray bullet. Callahan owned the biggest spread in Laramie County, a man who'd supposedly wrestled a grizzly barehanded. Last she heard, he'd been widowed 2 winters back when the diphtheria swept through. The wind kicked up, carrying the scent of sage and impending snow. The silent twin suddenly thrust forward her sack. "Blackberry jam," she whispered. "Daddy says you liked it at the county fair." Eliza's stomach nodded. She'd judged the pie contest 3 months ago, remembered voting for a blackberry cobbler with a perfect lattice crust. Had Callahan been watching her that close? Inside, the twins perched on her oakwood stools like nervous sparrows, their boots kicking at the iron stove's warmth. Eliza poured coffee strong enough to strip paint studding them over the rim of her tin cup. "Let's get this straight. Your pa sent you two alone through cougar country at sundown, just to deliver jam and compliments." The bold one, Maddie, she'd said, grinned like a jackalope in a carrot patch. "Nope, we came ourselves. Daddy's been building you a saddle. Rosewood with silver conchos. It's in our wagon." A log cracked in the fireplace, sending sparks dancing across the hearthstones. Somewhere out in the gathering dark, a wolf cried. Eliza felt the weight of every one of her 32 years, the loneliness of 4 winters, eating supper alone. She reached for the jam jar, running her thumb over the handwritten label, Wyatt's neat block letters under a clumsily drawn heart. The quiet twin Lucy touched her wrist. "He cries at night," she said softly, "but not when he talks about you." Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall. Eliza's fingers tightened around the jam jar as Wyatt Callahan's shadow filled her doorway, snow dusting the shoulders of his buffalo coat like powdered sugar. Behind her, the twins erupted into giggles, Maddie shouting, "Told you she'd like the jam," while Lucy hid her face in Eliza's apron. The man removed his hat, revealing a scar that ran from temple to jaw, a souvenir from the grizzly, no doubt. His eyes, the color of whiskey, held up to sunlight, locked onto hers. "Ma'am," he drawled, "I see my girls have been bending your ear." A gust of wind sent the door slamming against the wall, rattling the antler hooks where Eliza kept her lassos. Something thudded in the yard, the promised rosewood saddle tumbling from the twins' abandoned wagon. Wyatt didn't flinch. "They also tell me you're in need of a fence builder who can shoot straight." He continued, nodding at the crooked post visible through the window. "Turns out I'm between jobs." Lucy suddenly tugged Eliza's sleeve. "Daddy cries when he thinks we're asleep," she whispered loud enough to carry. "But he hums your favorite song, Red River Valley, when he fixes our braids." Wyatt's ears turned crimson. Eliza's pulse hammered like a farrier's anvil. She'd heard that melody drifting from the saloon piano last summer, remembered swaying in the shadows where no one could see. Now here stood the man who'd noticed. Outside, a chorus of howls erupted too close. Wyatt's hand went to his Colt. "Coyotes," Eliza asked. "Wolf pack," he corrected, stepping inside just as a gaunt gray shape materialized at the tree line. Maddie gasped. "It's the one-eyed female. She followed us from the river." Wyatt's voice dropped to gravel. "You girls crossed paths with La Loba. The legend every ranch hand knew, the wolf who'd stolen a dozen calves from the Bar W last winter." Eliza snatched her rifle from above the hearth. "You 3 stay put." But Wyatt was already shrugging out of his coat. "Reckon I'll earn my keep early." He tossed a rawhide cord to Lucy. "Tie this round that jam jar. We're fixing to make us a trade. Eliza's breath caught. Every rancher knew La Loba had a taste for sweets. Last spring, she'd raided a whole shipment of molasses at the rail depot. Wyatt winked at her, the scar on his face pulling into a half-smile. Unless you'd rather I just shoot her, the twins squealed as Eliza slammed the rifle back onto its pegs. Hell's teeth, Callahan, she growled, snatching the cord. You bring a man flowers, not a damn wolf. Outside, the one-eyed beast whined, her muzzle lifted toward the scent of blackberries. Wyatt's laughter rumbled through the cabin like distant thunder. Flowers die in 3 days. This, he nodded at the wolf now sitting obediently by the porch steps. She'll keep your sheep safe better than any rifle. Maddie tugged Eliza's hand. Daddy says gifts gotta be useful and beautiful. Lucy nodded solemnly. Like you. The embers popped. Somewhere in the night, the wolf pack answered their matriarch's new alliance. Eliza looked from the jam jar to the man who'd remembered her favorite song to the twins, already draping her quilt around the shivering predator on her porch. She reached for Wyatt's coat hanging by the door, thick enough for two, and shoved her arms into the sleeves, still warm from his body. You're sleeping in the barn, she announced, and tomorrow you're fixing that god-awful fence. Wyatt's grin could have powered a railroad spike through oak. Yes, ma'am. As the twins cheered, La Loba let out a contented huff and laid her head on Eliza's boots. The snow kept falling, but the cabin hadn't felt this warm in years. The morning sun had barely cleared the pines when Isabelle heard the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood behind the barn. She rounded the corner to find James Rowan's sleeves rolled past his elbows, muscles taut as he brought the blade down with practiced precision. A stack of firewood already stood waist-high enough to last a week. Sophie beamed from her perch on the chopping block. Papa said you shouldn't have to do everything alone, she announced, kicking her boots against the wood. Clara, ever the shadow, silently arranged kindling into a neat pyramid nearby. Isabelle's fingers tightened around the empty feed bucket. I've managed just fine for 8 years. James wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, his breath curling in the cold air. Didn't say you couldn't. He hefted another log. But even the toughest oak needs tending after a storm. The axe fell with a crack that sent a blue jay screeching from the fence post. Something warm and unfamiliar unfurled in Isabelle's chest. She opened her mouth to protest when a thunderous crash echoed from the road. All four turned as a runaway wagon careened around the bend, its team of panicked Mustangs foaming at the bit. The driver, some fool cowhand from the Bar X, was nowhere in sight. James moved faster than a striking rattler. He shoved the girls toward Isabelle and sprinted into the dust cloud, leaping onto the wagon tongue like he'd been born to it. The reins were tangled around the brake lever, the horses blind with terror. Isabelle watched heart in her throat as he rode the bucking rig like a bronco, one hand gripping the rail, while the other sawed at the tangled leather. Then came the sickening snap. The right trace chain gave way, sending the wagon lurching sideways toward the irrigation ditch. James didn't hesitate. He vaulted onto the lead horse's back, wrapping his legs around its heaving barrel and hauling the team to a shuddering stop mere feet from disaster. Silence, even the wind held its breath. Sophie broke it with a whisper. Papa used to drive chariots in the cavalry. Isabelle's knees nearly buckled. She'd seen men break under less hell. Her own husband had quit the land after one bad harvest. But this stranger, this James Rowan, with his quiet hands and reckless courage, stood there brushing dirt off his shirt like it was nothing. The twins rushed forward as he jumped down, but his eyes found Isabelle's first. You all right? He asked like she was the one who'd nearly been trampled. A laugh burst out of her, sharp and unexpected as a gunshot in church. You're bleeding! She pointed to the gash on his forearm, where a splintered board had caught him. He glanced at it bemused. So I am. Clara produced a handkerchief from her pocket, starched and embroidered with clumsy daisies. Mama's, she murmured, pressing it into Isabelle's hand before she could refuse. The linen was soft as a whisper against Isabelle's work-roughened fingers. She stepped forward without thinking, binding the wound with hands that hadn't touched a man with tenderness since the war. James went very still. Up close, he smelled of pine pitch and honest sweat, his pulse steady under her fingertips. Sophie's voice piped up from somewhere near the chickens. Does this mean we get to stay for lunch? The spell broke. Isabelle jerked back, but not before catching the ghost of a smile on James's face as he tested the bandage. Reckon we've earned it, he said, nodding to the wrecked wagon. After we fix that axle. Isabelle snatched up the feed bucket to hide the flush creeping up her neck. "You'll need more than honey and flowers to pay for that kind of labor," she tossed over her shoulder. Behind her, the twins' giggles mingled with the steady thunk of James's hammer as he set to work a sound that against all odds felt like coming home. The autumn market buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest when Isabelle rode in with the twins perched behind her saddle. Folks parted before them like creek water around a boulder, women clutching their skirts closer, men suddenly finding their boots fascinating. At the feed store, old man Henderson accidentally dropped her sack of grain, then stared pointedly at James Rowan's brand burned into the leather. Sophie, never one to miss a slight, planted her fists on her hips. "Our papa says only cowards talk behind their hands." The words rang clear as a church bell in the sudden hush. Isabelle was about to hush her when a familiar drawl cut through the crowd. "And he'd know." Sheriff Tate emerged from the mercantile, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. The silver star on his vest gleamed as he eyed Isabelle. "Rowan's got a particular way with folks who overstep." His gaze flicked to the fresh scar on her porch step, the one shaped like a boot heel, where Tate had kicked it loose last month during his routine inspection. Clara Silent, as always, reached into her pinafore and pulled out a twisted nail. She pressed it into the sheriff's palm with eerie calm. "Yours, I think." A muscle jumped in Tate's jaw. The whole town knew that nail, same as the ones mysteriously vanishing from his stable roof these past weeks. Isabelle bit back a grin. So that's why James had been teaching the girls blacksmithing. The standoff shattered when the bar ex-foreman shouldered through the crowd reeking of cheap whiskey. "Hartman," he slurred, jabbing a finger at Isabelle, "you best tell your hired hand to quit sniffing around our water rights." A murmur rippled through the market. The bar X had been diverting creek flow for months, leaving downstream ranches parched. Before Isabelle could respond, Sophie piped up, "Papa says stealing water's worse than stealing cattle. At least cows fight back." The foreman's face purpled. He lunged only to freeze when the twin barrels of a shotgun clicked behind him. James Rowan stood there, the weapon balanced easy in one hand, a crate of winter squash in the other. "Evening, Hank." His voice could have iced over hell. "Heard you lost another herd to the canyon last night. Odd how they keep wandering near that broken fence you swore was mended." The crowd inhaled as one. Everyone knew Hank's stampedes were cover for selling unbranded stock across the border. Isabelle watched James's knuckles whiten on the shotgun. This was the man who'd rebuilt her world nail by nail, quiet, relentless, and utterly without mercy when crossed. The realization hit her like a lightning strike. He hadn't just been fixing fences. He'd been drawing a line. Hank backed down, spitting in the dirt as he retreated. The market erupted into chatter, but Isabelle barely heard it. James was already turning away, his free hand brushing her elbow, a touch so light it could have been accidental, if not for the way his thumb traced the inside of her wrist. "Come on, girls," he said, hefting the squash. "Let's get these home before—" A gunshot cracked the air. James shoved Isabelle and the twins behind a water trough as splinters exploded from the mercantile doorframe. Hank stood in the street, his revolver smoking. "Ain't done with you, Rowan." Time slowed. Isabelle felt the weight of James' pistol pressed into her palm when had he drawn it, saw Clara calmly counting bullets in the dirt beside her. Sophie whispered, "Don't worry, Miss Belle. Papa never misses." James stepped into the open, his silhouette sharp against the setting sun. "Last chance, Hank." The second shot grazed James's shoulder, painting his shirt crimson. The third never came. James's bullet struck Hank's gun clean from his hand, the steel spinning through the air like a tossed coin. Silence. Then the twins burst into applause as if it were a county fair trick shot. Sheriff Tate finally moved, cuffing Hank while muttering about "damn fools who don't know when to fold." James barely glanced at his bleeding arm before crouching to check the girls. "Either of you hurt?" Clara shook her head, then produced of all things a lace handkerchief to press to his wound. Sophie beamed. "Can we practice shooting tomorrow?" Isabelle's knees gave out. She sat right there in the dusty street, James' pistol still warm in her grip, watching this man who fixed porch steps with the same care he used to face down killers. The pieces clicked together, the mended fences, the guarded looks in town, the way he always positioned himself between her and danger. James Rowan hadn't just been building a life. He'd been building a fortress. And Isabelle, whether she'd admit it or not, was already inside the walls. The moment Mick Dalton slunk back to the saloon, the market's chatter surged like floodwaters through a broken dam. Isabelle busied herself rearranging honey jars, her fingers trembling only slightly. James lingered nearby, pretending to examine a basket of walnuts, close enough to intervene, far enough to give her space. Then the twins materialized like tiny specters, Sophie pressing a cold tin cup of cider into Isabelle's hands, while Clara wordlessly mopped up the whiskey Mick had spilled with her apron. "Papa says men like that are all bark," Sophie announced loudly enough for nearby stalls to hear, "but their bite's about as sharp as a toothless hound." A snort of laughter escaped Isabelle before she could stop it. Across the way, Mick's friends shifted uncomfortably. One, a pockmarked ranch hand from the Circle K, dropped his gaze when Clara stared him down with those unsettlingly calm eyes. James finally turned from the walnuts, his voice pitched low. "You all right?" Isabelle took a long sip of cider to steady herself. The sweet, tart taste exploded on her tongue, spiked with just enough cinnamon to burn going down. "Since when do they serve hard cider at the market?" His lips quirked. "Since Sophie bribed the widow Jenkins with a jar of your honey." Before Isabelle could process that, a commotion erupted near the livery. A gangly teenager came sprinting through the crowd, his suspenders flapping. "Sheriff, somebody stole Miss Lottie's prize rooster." The market froze. In a town where livestock equaled survival, chicken thieves ranked just below horse rustlers. Sheriff Tate came barreling out of the saloon, his star askew. "Who saw anything?" Silence. Then Clara tugged Isabelle's sleeve. "It was Mick," she whispered. "His right pocket." Every head swiveled toward the saloon porch where Mick stood, suddenly very interested in his boots. Tate stomped over. "Empty your pockets, Dalton." "Like hell I will." Mick's hand flew to his revolver, only to find James already standing between him and the sheriff, arms crossed. "Now, Mick," James said, deceptively mild, "wouldn't want folks thinking you're the type to steal from widows and pull iron on lawmen." His boot tapped the porch board, the same one Isabelle had seen him replace last week after accidentally kicking it loose during a similar confrontation. Mick's fingers uncurled. A single golden feather drifted from his pocket as he reached for his coins. The crowd erupted. In the chaos, Isabelle felt a warm weight settle against her side, Sophie pressing something into her palm. A brass button stamped with the Bar X brand. "Found it near your squash crates," the girl murmured. "Mick's been cutting your wagon ties since August." The world narrowed to that single button in Isabelle's hand, to the way James' shoulders tensed, as if he sensed her fury even from 10 feet away. All those accidents, the spilled grain, the broken axle, the mysteriously open pasture gate, clicked into place like bullets in a cylinder. She was moving before she realized it, shoving through the crowd toward Mick just as Tate clamped irons on his wrists. "You son of a—" James caught her elbow. His grip was iron, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "Not here, Isabelle." His thumb brushed the inside of her wrist where her pulse hammered. "Not like this." The fight drained out of her, because standing there with James' calloused hand anchoring her, with the twins flanking her like tiny sentries, Isabelle Hartman realized something terrifying. She wasn't alone anymore. Across the street, Mick spat at her feet even as Tate dragged him away. "Enjoy your hired gun, Hartman. Won't always be there too." James didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. The way he shifted his stance, boots planted wide, one hand resting near his Colt, silenced Mick better than any shout. The twins mirrored him unconsciously, Sophie scowling while Clara coolly palmed another of those wicked-looking nails. The message was clear to everyone. This wasn't just Isabelle's fight now. As the sheriff hauled Mick toward the jail, the market's noise returned in a wave. The walnut vendor winked at Isabelle. "Reckon you just outsold every stall here today, ma'am." James finally released her arm, but the heat of his touch lingered. He nodded toward her table where a line of customers now waited, their arms laden with purchases. The twins scampered off to help Sophie, loudly announcing, "Honey's half price if you can name 3 flowers bees like—" Isabelle exhaled sharply. "You planned this." James adjusted his hat's sunlight, carving his profile into something stark and beautiful. "Ma'am," he said solemnly, "I purely resent that accusation." But the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the way he'd positioned himself so no one could approach her table without crossing his shadow, told another story. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, turning the honey jars to liquid gold. Somewhere, a fiddle started playing, and Isabelle Hartman, who hadn't danced in 8 years, suddenly understood what her heart had been trying to tell her since the day 2 little girls knocked on her door with jam and wild promises. The wind howled through the cottonwoods like a wounded animal as Isabelle bolted the shutters tight. The last anonymous note still burned in her memory. Your pretty gunman won't always be there to save you. She'd just banked the stove when a rhythmic thump, thump, thump echoed from the porch. Not the twins' eager knocks, not James's measured rap. This was furtive. Wrong. She reached for the Winchester above the hearth just as the first rock shattered the kitchen window. Glass rained across the floorboards as a whiskey-soaked voice slurred from the darkness. Ain't proper for a widow to take up with a killer Hartman. Another rock sailed through, smashing her blue willow platter, the last gift from her mother. Isabelle didn't hesitate. She fired through the broken pane, the report cracking the night air like lightning. Silence, then, again came Sophie's shriek from the barn loft. Isabelle's blood turned to ice. The twins were supposed to be at the cattle camp. She sprinted outside, nightgown whipping around her legs, to find James already vaulting the corral fence. His shirt was half-buttoned, his bare feet kicking up dust as he ran toward the barn where two small figures crouched in the hayloft doorway. Clara's voice carried clear as creek water. 3 men, one's got a busted harmonica in his back pocket. James didn't ask how she knew, just nodded and tossed Isabelle his second Colt. Cover the north pasture. The ambush unfolded with terrifying precision. Isabelle flanked the drunkards, recognized them as mixed cousins from the Circle K, while James moved like shadow through the cottonwoods. But it was Sophie who delivered the coup de grace, dumping a bucket of lantern oil onto the would-be arsonist's head from the loft. Strike a match, I dare you, the girl crowed, brandishing a fire steel like a tiny avenging angel. By dawn, Sheriff Tate had the men in irons, their threats turned to whimpers. The townsfolk who came to gawk found Isabelle sipping coffee on her porch, James coffee, while the twins demonstrated proper rock-throwing technique using expired turnips. But the real message was in the way James stood behind her chair, one hand resting on her shoulder as he surveyed the crowd. The way Clara quietly passed out squares of honeycomb to children, while Sophie accidentally stepped on the toe of the mercantile owner's wife, the same woman whose handwriting matched the anonymous notes. As the wagon carrying the prisoners rattled away, James bent close, his breath warm against Isabelle's ear. Still think we should stay quiet? She watched the twins chase fireflies through the morning mist, their laughter weaving through the pines. Felt the solid weight of James at her back. The answer came easier than she expected. Reckon it's time they learned the Hartman name isn't spoken lightly. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled. And for the first time in 8 years, Isabelle didn't feel like howling back. The fire roared like a living thing, devouring the hay barn in great crackling gulps. Isabelle herded the twins toward the water pump, their nightgowns flapping like ghostly flags in the hellish glow. Clara's small hands were already working the handle, filling buckets with mechanical precision, while Sophie screamed curses at the flames that would have made a seasoned cowboy blush. James emerged from the smoke like some avenging spirit, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the old cavalry tattoos on his forearms. He tossed Isabelle a soaked bandana. "Mixed friends?" she gasped, tying it over her nose. "Worse." His voice was grim. "Sheriff Tate's horse is tied behind the cider barn." The revelation hit like a bucket of ice water. The lawman who'd taken Mick away just hours ago was here. Now, watching his handiwork. Isabelle moved before thinking, snatching the shotgun from above the hearth. But James caught her wrist. "Not like this." His soot-streaked face was inches from hers. "We do it smart." A high-pitched whinny cut through the chaos. Isabelle's mare Daisy was trapped in the burning paddock. Without hesitation, Clara darted forward, slipping between the rails like a weasel. "Clara, no!" James bellowed, but the girl was already inside, murmuring to the panicked horse in that eerie, calming way of hers. What happened next would be told at county fairs for decades. Sophie grabbed the milk pail and sprinted toward the well, screaming, "Papa, the dynamite!" James paled, then understood. He lunged for the tool shed as Isabelle covered her mouth. They'd stored blasting caps there after clearing the south pasture. The explosion rocked the valley. Not from dynamite, from James hurling the entire water trough through the burning wall like it was made of paper. The resulting steam cloud gave Clara just enough cover to lead Daisy to safety, the mare's mane singed but her legs steady. As the barn collapsed in a shower of embers, Sheriff Tate came stumbling from the cider barn, his pants half-buttoned, revolver dangling from one hand. He took in the scene, the armed widow, the smoke-blackened twins, the ex-cavalryman now holding a pitchfork like it was a cavalry saber, and made his second mistake of the night. He raised his gun. The shot came from an unexpected direction. Old man Henderson stepped out from behind the smokehouse, his antique buffalo rifle still smoking. "Accident," he grunted, nodding at Tate's bleeding thigh. "Thought you was a lootin' Injun?" By dawn, the real story was clear. Tate had been taking bribes from Mick's family for years. The notes penned by the sheriff's own sister, the mercantile owner's wife. The town turned on them like starved wolves, their false piety burning quicker than the hay barn. As the new sheriff, a grizzled ex-Texas Ranger, hauled Tate away, James knelt in the ashes, turning over a half-melted harmonica. Clara's prediction had been right to the last detail. Isabelle studied the man who'd reshaped her world without asking permission. The way his shoulders sagged now that the fight was over. The careful fingers checking the twins for burns. The quiet promise in his eyes when he finally looked up at her. She didn't need words, just held out her hand. When James took it, his palm was rough and warm and exactly where it belonged. The twins whooped, Daisy nickered, and somewhere beyond the scorched earth, a meadowlark sang, as if the land itself was finally at peace. The confession burned in Isabelle's pocket like a live coal as she watched Brock Hanley's men load their gear under the cold light of dawn. The coward had signed not out of remorse, but because James had calmly pointed out the kerosene-soaked boot prints leading straight to Brock's favorite pair of hand-tooled riding boots. Sophie and Clara perched on the fence like tiny buzzards, taking vindictive pleasure in counting every item the Hanleys were forced to leave behind as reparations. "That's Aunt Bessie's butter churn," Clara noted quietly, pointing to a crate. "And Mama's silver hairbrush," Sophie added, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Isabelle's breath caught. She hadn't known, couldn't have guessed that Brock was the one who'd looted the Rowan homestead after James' wife died. The pieces fell into place, the midnight fires, the stolen livestock, the way James' eyes went flat whenever someone mentioned the Hanley spread. James stood motionless by the corral, watching Brock ride out with his tail between his legs. The morning sun painted his profile in gold, highlighting the fresh split in his lip and the bruise flowering along his cheekbone. Isabelle moved to his side, close enough that their sleeves brushed. "You knew it was him all along," she said quietly. James flexed his swollen knuckles. "Had my suspicions." The wind carried the scent of charred hay and wet earth. Somewhere in the pasture, Daisy whinnied, her voice mingling with the twins' laughter as they discovered a nest of kittens in the feed shed. Isabelle studied the man beside her, the way his shoulders relaxed just slightly when Clara brought him a cup of water, how his calloused fingers brushed Sophie's hair away from her eyes without thinking. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the confession, held it over the lantern flame until the edges curled black. James raised an eyebrow. "Don't need paper to prove what we already know," she said, watching the ashes drift skyward. "Besides," she nodded toward the twins, who were now attempting to herd the kittens into a wash tub, "some stories are better left unfinished." Understanding flickered in James' eyes. He didn't thank her. Didn't need to. Just reached for her hand, their palms fitting together like two pieces of a long broken fence finally mended. By noon, the whole valley knew the Hanleys were gone, the sheriff's corruption exposed, and the Carter ranch, once hanging by a thread, now stood stronger than ever. As Isabelle served lunch on the porch, cold chicken, fresh bread, and the last jar of blackberry jam, she caught James smiling at something Sophie said. Not the rare fleeting grin she'd seen before, but a real unguarded smile that reached his eyes. Clara noticed too. She slipped her small hand into Isabelle's and whispered, "He sounds like Mama's wind chimes when he laughs." The words settled deep, taking root beside all the other unspoken truths. Isabelle squeezed the girl's fingers and didn't let go. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and new grass, of fires extinguished and fresh beginnings. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a meadowlark sang three clear notes, bright as hope. And for the first time in 8 years, Isabelle Carter found herself singing along. The courtroom air thickened as Isabelle's gaze swept across the sea of familiar faces. Some curious, some hostile, most just hungry for drama. She took a slow breath, catching the faint scent of James' leather vest beside her, the twins' nervous energy behind her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear as a church bell. "My husband and I bought that South Lot fair and square in '82, paid with gold dust from his California claim." She reached into her pocket and slid a worn deed across the polished wood. "But this ain't about land." A rustle passed through the crowd. Judge Fletcher adjusted his spectacles. Isabelle turned to face Brock Hanley directly. "This is about a man who thought a widow's fences would be easy to jump, who burned my barn when I wouldn't sell, who stole from the Rowan family when they were burying their dead. Behind her, Clara made a small wounded sound. James' hand twitched toward his Colt, a movement so slight only Isabelle noticed. Brock's lawyer shot up. "Objection. These wild accusations are backed by evidence." The Denver attorney cut in, producing a second document. Sworn affidavit from Widow Jenkins confirming she saw Mr. Hanley's men loading silverware from the Rowan homestead onto their wagon the day after Mrs. Rowan's funeral. The courtroom erupted. Judge Fletcher's gavel cracked like gunfire. In the chaos, Isabelle locked eyes with Brock, saw the moment his bluster cracked, revealing the coward beneath. She leaned forward, planting both hands on the plaintiff's table. "You picked the wrong widow to bully Hanley." A collective gasp. Even the judge paused mid-gavel. Then, "Yeehaw!" Sophie's shrill cry pierced the room as she vaulted over the railing, brandishing a rusted branding iron like a tiny warrior. "That's our land and our kittens and Aunt Bessie's butter churn." Clara followed silent as a shadow and placed a single dirt-caked harmonica on the judge's bench. Brock paled, the same harmonica he dropped while fleeing the barn fire. Judge Fletcher sat back, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Hanley, I suggest you withdraw your claim before I hold you in contempt for arson and larceny." The gavel fell. The crowd roared. And as Brock slunk out, Isabelle turned to find James watching her, with an expression that made her knees weak, not admiration, but recognition. Like he'd known all along the steel she carried inside. Outside, the twins whooped and danced in the snow while the Denver lawyer shook James's hand. "Never seen a case turn that fast," he marveled. James just nodded toward Isabelle. "You're looking at the reason." The ride home was quiet, the wagon creaking under the weight of reclaimed belongings. Bessie's butter churn, Sarah Rowan's silver, even a crate of winter apples Brock had stolen last harvest. As the ranch came into view, smoke curled from the chimney, and the one-eyed wolf James had tamed trotted out to greet them. Clara pressed a cold hand against Isabelle's cheek. "You yelled real good," she whispered. Sophie grinned. "Can we go to court every week?" Isabelle laughed, a full, rich sound that startled even her. James's answering smile was slow and sweet as molasses. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang, and the wind carried the promise of spring. The war wasn't over, but this battle, this one they'd won. The morning sun caught the dust swirling around James' boots as he reined in his horse. Behind him, the twins bounced in their saddles like excited jackrabbits, their faces alight with some secret they could barely contain. Isabelle gripped the porch rail, her pulse hammering. 8 days. 8 endless days since the trial, since she'd watched them disappear over the ridge without so much as a goodbye. James dismounted with that effortless grace of his eyes never leaving hers. There was something different about him, the set of his shoulders looser, the lines around his eyes softer. Sophie and Clara tumbled from their ponies, rushing forward with identical flour sack bundles clutched to their chests. "We brought presents," Sophie announced, thrusting her parcel at Isabelle. The rough fabric fell away to reveal a tarnished silver picture frame, the one that had hung above the Rowan's hearth for generations. Inside, a new photograph, Isabelle standing proud outside the courthouse, James and the twins flanking her like steadfast shadows. Clara's bundle contained something heavier. Isabelle unfolded the cloth to reveal a branding iron, not the ranch's usual C, but a fresh design C&R, entwined with a stalk of wheat. James finally spoke, his voice rough as unplaned oak. "Figured it was time for a new mark." He nodded toward the horizon where a dust cloud signaled approaching riders. "Brought the whole damn valley with me, actually." Isabelle squinted as the shapes resolved into wagons, Widow Jenkins' piebald mare in the lead, Old Man Henderson's mule team bringing up the rear. The entire town seemed to be rolling toward her ranch, their wagons laden with lumber, food, and even a fiddle player tuning up on the buckboard. Sophie tugged Isabelle's sleeve. "They're here for the barn raising, and the—" She glanced at her father, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "And the wedding, if you'll have us." The world tilted. Isabelle's fingers tightened around the branding iron, the metal warm from Clara's hands. She looked at James. Really looked, as saw the hope warring with fear in those whiskey-colored eyes, the way his thumb worried at the fresh calluses on his palm. A dozen responses crowded her tongue. Jokes about his terrible timing, questions about where he'd really been these past days, warnings about her sharp edges and stubborn ways. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the deed to the south lot, now bearing 2 signatures where there'd only been one before. James' breath caught. He hadn't expected her to find it. Hadn't known she'd been carrying his mother's wedding band in that same pocket for 3 days straight. The first wagon rolled into the yard, its occupants cheering. Someone fired a celebratory shot into the air. The twins whooped and raced off to greet them, but James stayed rooted, his gaze locked on Isabelle. "Well, Hartman," he murmured, using her maiden name for the first time since they'd met. "You gonna make an honest man of me or not?" The branding iron clattered to the porch as Isabelle grabbed his collar. Their lips met with the sweet inevitability of rain after drought, of green shoots breaking through scorched earth. Somewhere behind them, Widow Jenkins cackled, and the fiddle launched into a lively reel. When they finally broke apart, James pressed his forehead to hers, his voice rough with emotion. "Should warn you the girls picked out your wedding dress. It's, unconventional." Isabelle laughed against his mouth, tasting dust and promise and home. "Try and stop me." And as the sun climbed high over Rattlesnake Ridge, the valley echoed with the sound of hammers and laughter, of old wounds healing, and new beginnings taking root, one nail, one kiss, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. The silver ring caught the sunlight as Isabelle pressed her palm to the freshly turned earth, the cool metal already warm against her skin. James knelt beside her, his broad hands carefully covering the seeds they'd just sown, winter wheat, hardy enough to survive the coming frost. Sophie's voice carried across the field as she demonstrated proper planting technique to Clara, who was solemnly arranging pebbles in neat rows like miniature fence posts. "See, you gotta tell 'em they're gonna grow up big and strong," Sophie instructed, patting the dirt with exaggerated care. "Like Papa does with the colts." James chuckled, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. Isabelle watched as he reached into his pocket and produced a handful of wildflower seeds, blue flax and prairie coneflower, scattering them along the edge of the field where the wheat met the untamed land. For the bees," he murmured, his calloused fingers brushing hers as he passed her the last few seeds. The simple gesture unraveled something in Isabelle's chest. This man who tracked predators by starlight, who could break a Mustang with nothing but patience and a soft rope, who'd face down Brock Hanley without blinking, this man carried flower seeds in his pockets. Sophie suddenly shrieked with delight. "Look! Look!" She pointed to the horizon where a familiar one-eyed silhouette trotted toward them, a squirming bundle in her jaws. La Loba dropped her prize at Isabelle's feet, a fat jackrabbit, very much alive, and sat back on her haunches with canine satisfaction. James sighed. "Guess we're having stew tonight." Clara, ever practical, already had her knife out. "I'll skin it." Isabelle burst out laughing, the sound mingling with James's groan and Sophie's enthusiastic butchering instructions. The wolf panted happily, her tail thumping in the dirt, as if pleased with her contribution to the family larder. As twilight painted the prairie in shades of gold and violet, they gathered on the porch, James whittling a new handle for Isabelle's favorite hoe, the twins braiding each other's hair with wildflowers, La Loba gnawing contentedly on a marrowbone. Isabelle leaned against the porch post, her ring glinting as she stirred a pot of rabbit stew. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be droughts and blizzards, rustlers and rumors. But as the first stars blinked to life above them, Isabelle realized something with sudden clarity. She wasn't just standing on her husband's land anymore. This was their soil, their sky, their story written not in the ink of courtroom documents or the ashes of burned barns, but in the quiet, stubborn rhythm of seeds breaking open, in the dark of roots reaching deep, of love, growing wild and unbreakable as the prairie itself. Somewhere out in the gathering night, a coyote yipped. The twins giggled, James' shoulder pressed warm against hers. And Isabelle Hartman, once Carter, soon to be Rowan, smiled into the dusk, her heart as full as the harvest moon rising over Rattlesnake Ridge.